I'd like to thank the journal for setting up the conference that precipitated my putting together this paper, and for presenting it in your special issue, which is a great place from my point of view to have people look at this and read it. This work is the culmination of a couple of strands of thinking in my professional lifetime that have been going on for quite a long time. One of them has to do with the desirability of integrating classical political economy and Marxist political economy more closely with um, modern tools of analysis. A second has to do with trying to update tools of analysis in economic theory and mathematical economics in general to include information theory concerns. And those two elements may seem rather far apart, but I think as I think about them, they actually began to converge. I started to talk about this general convergence in my Schumpeter lecture, which was published in 2003 as Unholy Trinity, where I tried to make the point that it's useful to understand classical political economy and Marxian political economy as in some ways a predecessor or precursor of modern complexity system analysis. So that's the line of thinking that this paper tries to develop in the broadest sense. The paper has a number of different topics, but I think you could summarize them in three major parts. The first part is really methodological and has to do with developing tools of analysis, in particular two concepts that are central to the rest of the paper. One is the generalization of choice theory to the case where the decision maker is entropy constrained, has an information constraint on the entropy of the resulting behavior. And that line of thinking, which is partly comes from a work that I did with Ellis Scharfenaker and also echoes work, say, in the rational inattention literature that stems from the work of Christopher Sims, leads to a generalization of choice theory that has several interesting and, in my view, very positive advantages. For one thing, in that theory, in that model, decision makers don't choose just the best outcome from their own point of view or of payoff. Instead, they always put some positive frequency on every action that they have available to themselves. I think that's more realistic and fits better with the empirical information, empirical studies of quantal response behavior. But it also has some very interesting implications. For one thing, that model is essentially equivalent to a model of bounded rationality satisficing, because you can equally well view it as maximizing entropy subject to a constraint on the expected payoff of the decision maker, which links it up with work over many years of people like Will Baumol on satisficing and Herb Simon on bounded rationality. So that's one important methodological element. The second methodological element is what I call the social interaction model, which is actually a way of combining prisoner's dilemma and assurance games models in a single analytical framework. and simplifying that framework by assuming that all of the agents who are interacting in the society are effectively identical. That simplifies the analysis of outcomes through symmetry. And the basic idea there is that when typical agent's behavior depends on the average of all the other identical agents' behavior, then in equilibrium, you're going to have two results. One is that everybody is going to be doing the same thing because that's the equilibrium condition. And second, that typically what they're going to be doing is not going to be socially coordinated or Pareto efficient. In order for Pareto efficiency to occur, you would have to have all of the agents do not necessarily their payoff maximizing response, but the response that they would choose if they could determine the behavior of all the other agents to be the same as the behavior that they chose. I think this is a very useful framework, for example, to make the distinction between typical agent models and representative agent models, because in this framework, the typical agent does not internalize all of the external impacts of behavior. And the paper then shows that you can combine the entropy constrained behavior of the first part of the paper with the social interaction model. And the result is a unified model that encompasses both prisoner's dilemma kind of interactions and also assurance game kinds of interactions where there are several, in this case, usually two equilibrium outcomes, but they are actually rankable in terms of their social desirability. So that's the first part of the paper. The second main point the paper tries to make is to reconstruct classical political economy, particularly the versions of it that we find in Adam Smith's long period method and Marx's discussion of what he calls the theory of value, which is also a theory of social allocation of labor. And that line of thinking illustrates the relevance of these methodological tools to several key issues. The framework that I propose for that is what I call a hub and spoke model, which is a non-convex economies of scale technology in which individual producers face economies of scale towards specializing. So I think that it's a mistake to try to understand Smith and Marx in terms of convex production modeling of the kind that underlies general equilibrium theory, for example. And try to emphasize the difference between those two ways of looking at these questions. The problem of social coordination arises in the hub and spoke model in several different guises, which I discuss. One is how do you get labor allocated properly among different specializations? The second is once you have, if you manage to get labor allocated, in a viable way, how do you distribute the resulting product, since each individual specialized producer is going to wind up with more of their own product than they need. And that third question leads to the discussion of barter and monetary exchange, which is an area where the social coordination framework throws considerable light on the whole issue of double coincidence of wants and the emergence of what Marx calls a socially accepted general equivalent. One important implication of that is that there's path dependency in that process. So while you can predict with great confidence that some commodity or tradable asset is going to emerge as a socially accepted general equivalent, there's going to be path dependency about just which commodity or which asset plays that role in any particular commodity producing society. And then the third part of the paper tries to look more closely at Marxian, the appearance of these themes of social coordination and behavior in the Marxian framework. One application that I find pretty interesting is just the notion that although all of the agents in this specialized division of labor are exactly the same, and they all effectively face exactly the same dilemma about how to interact with society, they find themselves fragmented into these specialized units of production, which is, in my view, closely connected with what a lot of what Marx has to say about alienation of labor, and helps to understand just why Robinson Crusoe models of production are particularly inappropriate to understand the dilemmas of the social interaction model with a specialized division of labor, because Crusoe internalizes all of the decisions that become problematic in the hub and spoke framework. And finally, the paper applies this general reasoning to a particular but very important part of Marx's theory, namely the falling rate of profit. And the perspective there is to say, well, the falling rate of profit story that Marx tells looks like it's a social coordination problem from the point of view of the capitalists as a class. They're all trying to maximize the rate of profit, but they wind up in their choice of technique in lowering the rate of profit. And the aim of that section of the paper is to clarify the logic of that and to show that it stems from the assumption that Marx makes of what I call an additive externality in the production model, namely the assumption that there's a constant value of labor power, or equivalently for Marx, rate of exploitation, so that when one capitalist adopts a technique with a higher labor productivity, they also implicitly tend to push up the wage to keep the value of labor power constant. And it's that unintended consequence of technical change that drives the falling rate of profit in the version that the paper covers. So that's a summary of main points. If you're asking if we're thinking about future lines of work, I actually find this whole approach quite exciting and very fertile in research questions that are interesting, not just because they're important, like the falling rate of profit or the whole question of stability of demand in capitalist commodity production, but because these new tools offer the chance to get a new perspective on them and to say much more definite things about the solution of these questions than we can arrive at by, if we limit ourselves to the language and perspective of the classical political economists themselves. From the point of view of the history of thought, I think there's a great deal more to be learned from looking at the classical political economists, especially Smith's long period method and Marx's development of the long period method, as a quite extraordinary intellectual moment where social science preempted or previewed the development of complex systems theory that eventually became very important in fields like statistical physics. And I know that there's some work on that. I know that the work on the importance of the Scottish Enlightenment and Smith for the German idealist philosophers. I don't know if there's have been quite as much work linking up the general point of view of Smith and Marx and the classical political economists as to the self-organization of commodity producing and capitalist commodity producing society as an example of a complex adaptive system. So that's one area that I think is worth looking into. I also think that there's a tendency for the debate, especially in Marxist economics, to get stuck on issues that, in fact, we could move beyond if we apply some of these information theoretic and game theoretic methods in order to clarify the questions. For example, the importance of the theory of money in Marx seems chronically to be underestimated in the 20th century literature on things like the transformation problem. So you get one thing that I'm always amazed by is that Sraffa, who actually started his academic career as a monetary economist, when he returns to the problem of reconstructing Marx's theory of value later, seems to drop the whole issue of the importance of money. Whereas I think the line of argument that I put forward in this paper and in some related papers makes clear that you really can't understand Marx's theory without understanding it in terms of a monetary theory, because it's really the mobility of labor that enforces the uniformity of a rate of exploitation and therefore the conservation of surplus value in the conservation of unpaid labor in realized money surplus value.